Okay, so you've given us some really compelling stuff to dig into. I mean, this set of materials you sent, it's all about communism, right?
Yeah.
And that's a topic that, well, people have some pretty strong feelings about it.
Absolutely. It's definitely a subject that sparks debate, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're going to try to do today is really get to the heart of it. We're talking about, what are the core concepts? Like, what is communism really trying to achieve in theory? And then, of course, there's the whole question of what's actually happened when people have tried to put these ideas into practice.
Yeah, the real world application of these ideas is a whole other layer, isn't it?
Right. And I think that's where a lot of the disagreements and controversies come in. So we want to cut through all of that noise and really understand what we're dealing with here. You've sent us this pasted text and the overview called Understanding Communism, Core Principles and Global Impact. Those are going to be our guides for this deep dive.
Perfect. They provide a really solid basis for exploring this topic. I'm excited to get into it.
Me too. Okay, so let's start with the basics. When we say communism, what are we actually talking about?
So, at its most fundamental level, communism is envisioned as both a political and an economic system. And what sets it apart is this idea that instead of individuals owning things, ownership of property is collective.
Collective. Okay, so we're talking about like instead of me owning my house or my car, everything belongs to everyone.
Right. It's a system where the concept of private property, whether it's land, factories, natural resources, even personal belongings, it essentially fades away.
Wow. That's a pretty big shift from how most of us think about things, right?
It is. It's a radical idea. And this ties directly into the goals of communism, which are to eliminate social classes and ultimately to do away with the need for a government altogether.
Okay, so no rich and poor, no bosses and workers, and eventually no government. That's ambitious, to say the least.
Yeah, it's a really transformative vision. And your sources highlight that the ultimate aim is to create the society that is both classless and stateless.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is where that famous Karl Marx quote comes in, right? From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
Exactly. That phrase really encapsulates the core principle of how a communist society is supposed to work. In theory, at least.
So let's break that down a bit. From each according to his ability, meaning people contribute what they can.
Right. Everyone contributes to society based on their skills and talents. And then, to each according to his needs, means that everyone's needs are met, regardless of how much they're able to contribute.
So someone who's, I don't know, a brilliant surgeon would use their skills to help people, and in return they'd get all the food, housing, healthcare they need?
In theory, yes. The idea is to create a system where everyone has what they need to live a good life, regardless of their profession or their ability to produce.
Okay. That's a big part of what makes this idea so different from the way most societies operate today. And that brings us back to the idea of no private property. So if everything is owned collectively, how does that actually work?
Well, the thinking is that this collective ownership is the key to eliminating economic inequality.
Because if no one individual can accumulate a ton of wealth or control all the resources.
Exactly. You remove the fundamental basis for the division between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay, I can see the logic there.
Right.
And the sources use this term classless society to describe that outcome.
Right. The idea is that without private property, you wouldn't have these rigid social hierarchies based on wealth or economic status. Everyone would theoretically be on equal footing.
Got it. So we've tackled no private property and a classless society. Now let's talk about how the economy would function under this system. The sources refer to a planned economy, right? What does that mean exactly?
So in a planned economy, instead of having companies competing with each other in a free market, the government or some kind of collective body makes the decisions about what goods and services are produced and how they're distributed.
So it's like instead of supply and demand driving the economy, you have this central planning authority figuring out how much of everything is needed and who gets what.
Exactly. And this is a really key difference from the way most economies operate today, which are based on competition and the pursuit of profit.
Yeah, the profit motive is totally removed in this system, right?
Right. The focus shifts from individual gain to meeting the needs of the entire community.
So if there's no profit motive, what motivates people to work hard and, come up with new ideas? I mean, that's a big question, right?
It is, and it's one of the areas where critics of communism often raise concerns. They argue that without the incentive of personal gain, people will be less motivated to innovate or to go the extra mile.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
But I guess the counter-argument from a communist perspective would be that people would be motivated by a sense of community and a desire to contribute to the common good.
Exactly. The belief is that people would find fulfillment in working for the benefit of all rather than just for their own personal enrichment.
Okay, I can see how that could be appealing, at least in theory. But it definitely requires a shift in how we think about work and motivation.
For sure. And that brings us to probably the most radical aspect of communist theory, which is this idea of statelessness.
Right. I mean, this is where things get really mind-bending. So the idea is that eventually even the government itself becomes unnecessary.
Exactly. The theory is that once you've achieved a truly egalitarian and self-managing society, there's no need for a state to enforce laws or maintain order.
So who makes the decisions then? Who runs things if there's no government?
Well, that's where things get a little fuzzy, even in theory. The general idea is that people would govern themselves at a local or community level.
So it's like this highly decentralized system where decisions are made by consensus.
Something like that. But again, it's important to remember that this stateless communist society has never actually existed. It's a theoretical ideal, not something that's been achieved in the real world.
Got it. So we've laid out the basic framework of communist theory. But where did all these ideas come from in the first place?
Well, the intellectual roots of communism are usually traced back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German thinkers who were writing in the 19th century.
Oh yeah, I've definitely heard those names before, but I'll be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
No worries, it's a lot to unpack. Their most famous work is probably the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848. It laid out a lot of the core principles of communist theory.
Okay, so what were the main ideas that Marx and Engels were putting forward?
Well, one of their key insights was that history is fundamentally driven by class struggle.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
They argued that throughout history, societies have always been divided between those who control the means of production, the factories, the land, the resources, and those who work for them.
So you have the haves and the have-nots.
Exactly. And they gave these groups specific names. They called the ruling class the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie. And the working class, those who have to sell their labor to survive, they called the proletariat.
Okay, so the bourgeoisie are like the factory owners and the wealthy elite. And the proletariat are the workers and the everyday people.
Precisely. And Marx and Engels believed that this fundamental conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was at the heart of every major historical event. They saw it as the driving force of history.
So they saw capitalism, which was the dominant economic system of their time, as inherently unfair because it created this huge power imbalance between the owners and the workers.
Exactly. They viewed capitalism as a system that exploited the working class and enriched the ruling class. And they believed that this exploitation would eventually lead to a revolution.
A revolution where the workers overthrow the capitalists and establish a new, more equitable system.
Right. And for Marx and Engels, that new system was communism.
Wow. So that's the theory. But what about the reality? Have there ever been any successful communist revolutions?
Well, that depends on how you define successful. There have been a number of countries that have attempted to build communist societies in the 20th and 21st centuries, but it's important to note that none of them have fully realized the vision that Marx and Engels laid out.
Right. It seems like that stateless, truly classless society has never actually materialized anywhere.
Exactly. And the sources you've provided actually go into some detail about the challenges and complexities of putting communist theory into practice.
So let's talk about some of the real-world attempts. The USSR, right? That's probably the most famous example.
Definitely. The Soviet Union was the first major communist state. It was founded in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. And for much of the 20th century, it was seen as the model for communist revolution around the world.
Right. And then there's China. They had their own communist revolution in 1949, led by Mao Zedong.
Yep. Mao's interpretation of communism differed in some key ways from the Soviet model. He placed a much stronger emphasis on the role of the peasantry in the revolution.
Interesting. So even within communism, there are different schools of thought and different ways of approaching it.
Absolutely. And the sources likely touch on some of those differences. There's also Cuba, which has been governed by a communist party since 1959, and North Korea and Vietnam, which are also still officially communist states today.
So those are some of the big names. But I think the really crucial question is, how did these attempts at building communist societies actually turn out? Did they live up to the ideals of equality and liberation?
Well, that's where things get complicated. As your sources point out, the historical record is pretty mixed.
Yeah, I was reading that a lot of these communist regimes ended up being quite authoritarian,
Hmm.
not exactly the utopian vision that Marx and Engels had in mind.
That's a fair assessment. While these countries did make strides in some areas, like expanding access to education and healthcare, they also tended to be very repressive. They often limited individual freedoms, suppressed dissent, and had pretty poor human rights records.
Yeah, I was reading about the gulags in the Soviet Union, the Cultural Revolution in China. It's pretty grim stuff.
Yeah.
So, what do you think accounts for that? Why did these attempts at creating communist societies so often devolve into authoritarianism?
Well, one factor is the sheer difficulty of centrally planning an entire economy.
Right, we talked about that earlier, the planned economy.
Right. It's a lot harder than it sounds to effectively allocate resources and meet people's needs when you're doing it all from the top down. And when those plans fail, as they often did, it creates shortages, economic hardship, and resentment. And that can lead to instability and a crackdown on dissent.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like in a lot of cases, the communist parties that came to power became very entrenched and resistant to any kind of challenge or criticism.
That's right. And that concentration of power without any real checks and balances can easily lead to corruption and abuse. And, the sources you provided highlight this tension between the theoretical ideals of communism and the realities of how it's often been implemented. It's a really important point to keep in mind.
It is. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the potential advantages of communism. I mean, even if the real-world attempts haven't been perfect, there must be some reasons why people find this ideology appealing, right?
Of course, there are definitely some compelling arguments in favor of communism, at least in its ideal form.
So let's talk about those. What are the pros, so to speak?
Well, one of the biggest appeals of communism is its emphasis on equality. The idea is to create a society where everyone has equal access to resources, opportunities, and a good standard of living.
So no poverty, no extreme wealth, no one struggling to make ends meet while others live in luxury. That's a powerful vision.
It is. And another key advantage is the focus on collective well-being. Instead of prioritizing individual profit, the goal is to work together to meet everyone's needs.
So it's more about cooperation and shared responsibility than cutthroat competition.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are some of the potential upsides, but of course there are downsides as well. We've already touched on some of them, like the tendency towards authoritarianism. But what are some other disadvantages of communism, especially in practice?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is the lack of individual freedom.
Right. In a system where the government controls so much of life, there's not a lot of room for personal choice or initiative.
Right. And that can extend to things like freedom of speech, freedom of movement, even freedom of thought.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine having a truly free and open society under a communist regime.
It is. And then there's the issue of economic inefficiency. As we've discussed, centrally planned economies often struggle to keep up with the demands of a complex society.
Leading to shortages,
Yeah.
low-quality goods, and a lack of innovation, right?
Exactly. And that can have a real impact on people's everyday lives.
Right. So it seems like there's this fundamental tension at the heart of communism. On the one hand, you have these really lofty ideals about equality and social justice. But on the other hand, the practical realities of putting those ideals into practice have often been pretty disappointing.
That's a great way to put it. It's a constant struggle to balance those aspirations with the complexities of the real world.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they keep in mind as they continue to learn about and think about communism?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that communism is a complex and multifaceted ideology. It's not just one thing. There are different interpretations, different schools of thought, different ways of approaching it.
Right. It's not as simple as just good or bad. It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to approach the subject with an open mind and a willingness to engage with different perspectives. Read widely, listen to people who have different experiences, and try to understand the historical context in which these ideas developed.
I think that's really good advice. And I would add that it's important to be aware of both the potential benefits and the potential drawbacks of communism.
Absolutely. It's not about blindly accepting or rejecting the ideology wholesale. It's about understanding its complexities and grappling with its contradictions.
Right. And it's about thinking critically about how these ideas might apply to the world we live in today.
Precisely. And that leads to an interesting question for your listeners to consider. If we acknowledge that achieving true equality is a worthwhile goal, but we also recognize the historical challenges and potential pitfalls of communist systems, how can we work towards a more just and equitable society without falling into the traps of authoritarianism and economic inefficiency?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It's something that requires ongoing dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to experiment and learn from both our successes and our failures.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Thank you so much for this deep dive. I hope our listeners found it informative and thought-provoking.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.